Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Later tonight, the fourth part of my conversation with Andrew Roberts, author of Napoleon, the Great, Napoleon Alive. We'll close with the spectacular tragedy of the March on Moscow, the burning of Moscow. This is 1812. Tchaikovsky Symphony describes the romantic part, but the bloody-minded part is that the whole French army was destroyed out of Napoleon's vanity. 200 years ago, 1812. The conclusion of the episode leads to Waterloo, of course. This is the 200th anniversary commemoration of Waterloo. And yet, after speaking with Roberts over many months, I've come to a fresh understanding of Bonaparte, Napoleon I, and that the claim that he was the Enlightenment on horseback is not inaccurate. We're looking at someone inventing governance, the Napoleonic Code, and the idea that someone who is not royal, who is common, who is not even part of the French Empire when he is born in Corsica, he's mostly Italian, can rise up to lead and lead successfully. Yes, he hit his limits. Yes, the kings gathered against him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and they destroyed him. But the fact is, Napoleon was ahead of his time to understanding of good public policy and leadership. Here we are in the 21st century, and we're looking for much the same thing, so I welcome my guide to leadership and good public policy, Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, the host of Opinion Journal at WSJ Live each day at 1:30 p.m. And within these last hours, and you can watch these videos, and Mary's going to give us a preview of what she talked about. She spoke with two members of the editorial board, her colleagues, Joe Rago and James Freeman. First, with Mr. Rago, we're anticipating King v. Burwell, the decision we believe it's going to come at the final day of June from the Supreme Court. This is a decision that will or will not change the direction of the Affordable Care Act, but your conversation with Mr. Rago pointed to changes already underway, already happening, and they have to do with consolidation. Please explain, Mary.
Hi, good evening, John. It's great to be back with you. So Joe and I talked about the consolidation that's about to happen in the healthcare insurance industry, and this sounds very, very boring, but it's just a piece, a big piece, but a piece of the larger restructuring of the healthcare industry because of Obamacare. Now, we don't know who is going to combine with whom. There are 5 big insurers. Joe didn't know. He said maybe they will turn into 3, maybe they will turn into 2. But it also mirrors the consolidation that's going on in the hospital space. So all of that entrepreneurship, that small town doctor that would wake up and answer your phone call, that is no more, because all of the industry is essentially consolidating into these big hospitals, and then the big insurers are consolidating in response. And why are they doing so? Because they have to deal with massive, massive regulations and complexity out of Washington that is just much better dealt with when you're bigger. It's like what happened, for example, to our banks, John. It's kind of a similar story.
It reminds me also of the consolidation of the car manufacturers. What's that, about 15 years ago or more, back in the late 20th century, when all the choices were coming together so that you had buyouts and buyouts. I remember Daimler-Benz when they bought Chrysler. That did not work out well, but it was a global effort to consolidate. And what is that called? Economies of scale, I think.
Economies of scale, but it's one thing to have a market signal that economies of scale is a good thing for the economy and efficient and good for consumers and good for business owners and good overall. It's an entirely different thing when you have a bureaucrat making a law, or a regulation, rather, and an industry reacting to that. It means that maybe you're not moving towards the most efficient outcome that is not the best solution for consumers or for owners or for risk takers.
The Republican Party right now is rich with candidates, and Mary had a conversation with James Freeman, the assistant editorial page editor at the Wall Street Journal, about 2 of the candidates proposing what looks to be a way out of the valley of death called the Income Tax Code. 73,000 pages that no human being understands. I haven't asked the computers. In any event, Rand Paul and Marco Rubio, 2 of the young and bright stars for the Republican Party, Rand Paul of Kentucky, Marco Rubio of Florida, have both proposed changes in the tax code. Both of them are simpler. And I want to begin with Rand Paul because that was fresh. This is the flat tax, Mary. Flat tax how?
Well, the flat tax, of course, was championed by Steve Forbes many, many years ago, who put it on the national agenda. And we really haven't heard much about it since then. Well, here we go. Rand Paul today on our pages said, let's blow up the tax code, all 70,000 such pages of it, and get rid of all of the exemptions. And if we do that, we can actually lower the rate to something like 14.5, both for individuals and for businesses. And this does not blow up the budget, John. To the contrary, it creates millions of jobs. It creates 10% GDP growth. It is a fantastic idea.
It's a wonderful idea. Why aren't we doing it?
It's a wonderful idea because it takes real political courage, and it takes
the answer.
Well, no, wait, hang on, John, hang on, let me finish. It takes a political moment when the country is desperate for it, and that moment was not there when Steve Forbes was proposing this idea. But I think that moment could be now, because essentially everyone in America knows that something is wrong, that it's not right that we're growing at 2%.
Two people living next to each other earning exactly the same will have radically different obligations to the government.
Well, yes, but also, I hate this word fair. What's fair? What's a fair tax system? Did I use the wrong word, John?
I know. Fair, the little bird comes down in the studio and you win the prize.
Well,
fair doesn't exist.
Fair
is a political angle. That's what you're attacking with it.
And what is fairer than having everybody pay the same % of their income? And now look, we can set a line and say below X line, you're too poor to pay anything, although I imagine that everyone should pay at least $1 so that they are invested in the system somehow. But this is really a marker, John. This is a major moment for the Republican Party, and it's a challenge to every other candidate.
I want to see the flat tax debated in the debates. Now, part 2 is Marco Rubio, who's winning a great deal of attention because he's from Florida, because he's a good public speaker. But and I believe that he earlier on in the season was talking with Mike Lee of Utah. They were talking about a tax reform, but they're maintaining some exemptions. How many, Mary?
Well, there are some good parts to Rubio's plan. He would lower the corporate tax rate to not as much as Rand Paul would, to 25% from 35%.
Any direction is positive.
Any direction is positive. He'd get rid of the double taxation on cap gains, dividends, all those things. That's fantastic. However, he would also raise the child tax credit to $2,500 per head. There may be many parents out there across America saying, that's great. I want that. I have a kid, or I have 10 children. That's a wonderful boon to me. However, it does nothing for economic growth, and that's a problem because it means that he cannot lower rates in his plan to nearly the same level that Rand Paul would, and he probably wouldn't get the same economic benefits. And Marco Rubio should know better.
The Rubio plan and the Rand Paul plan are 2 of the first, and you did tag, Mary, before you closed the conversation. We're waiting for Jeb Bush on this.
Yes, we are.
We don't know what his plan is. He's now a candidate. Finally, because we're waiting for King v. Burwell, the decision about the Affordable Care Act, there are other things that we're waiting for from the Supreme Court, and you spoke to Ilya Shapiro of the Cato Institute, and he apparently has been filing briefs, and he's waiting for 7 of his 8 briefs to come in.
He's a busy guy.
This is a tangle. I wrote them down. Mary puts them up on the screen. You can write them down too and say, I've never heard of these things. The one I seized on was Michigan versus EPA. This has to do with whether the EPA is going to gain control of our power plants. It sounded like science fiction.
Well, it's like a lot of what's happened under the Obama administration. They have really pushed the limits of the law, and in many cases done illegal things through the regulatory state. So that's one of those cases.
And the one that Mary can speak at length because she's written about this. What is disparate impact? This is Texas Department of Housing versus Inclusive Communities Project.
Right. Disparate impact is the idea you can discriminate against someone without intentionally discriminating, that your neutral action has a disparate effect on certain communities, has a disparate outcome. So I could have a hiring policy that says you have to be able to shoot a gun to be a police officer, but it has an impact where disabled people who can't lift their arms can't shoot the gun can't become police officers. So you've unintentionally discriminated against the disabled. That's the idea. This case concerns the 1968 Fair Housing Act. It's complicated. You can read our editorials if you want. But essentially the idea is the Supreme Court going to allow the administration to sue companies and business owners for unintentional discrimination that the text of the law does not allow? The text of the law does not say that that's a legal thing to do. So the question is, will the courts allow this interpretation, this reading of the law, or not?
Is this case typical of the Obama administration's interpretation using disparate impact? I believe I've heard you talk about this subject with other cases, not this Supreme Court case.
Congress wrote this idea into law under the first Bush administration for employment, but not for housing cases. The text of the law in this Fair Housing Act is different than Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So it is truly a question, is the court going to read the letter of the law, or are they just going to make it up to allow these abuses to continue?
Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the host of Opinion Journal, and the videos with Ilya Shapiro, James Freeman, and Joe Rago are available on the Wall Street Journal site right now at WSJ Live each day at 1:30 p.m. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.